All right, welcome back to chapter 15 of the Digital Investigator Handbook. So today we're going to be focusing on the IoT forensics. This module is all going to be understanding things like IoT architecture, investigating drone and automotive systems, and we're even going to be looking at the advanced hardware extraction techniques like chip-off extraction. And we need to know that IoT forensics is going to help us bridge the gap between digital and physical investigations. We need to understand that our standard hard drive imaging tools like FTK Imager are often going to be completely useless in the IoT scenarios. Now, our learning objectives for this chapter are in these three main focus areas. First is going to be in architecture. We're going to explore things like the edge, the gateway, the cloud layers, and these are the ecosystem where all of these evidence are going to live. Second, we're going to look at specific non-traditional devices like drones, smart cars, and medical equipment. And then finally, we're going to look at advanced hardware extraction techniques like JTAG, UART, and chip-off embedded systems. Now, the exam itself is going to test your knowledge on where this evidence is most likely going to reside in an IoT ecosystem. Be prepared to identify the functional differences between an edge, gateway, and cloud data system. Now, the Internet of Things operates at the principle that everything is connected. IoT refers to the physical objects embedded within sensors and software, and it's designed to exchange data. The scale is massive. It's going to encompass billions of devices from light bulbs to jet engines. This blurs the line between physical crime scenes and digital evidence, turning all of these devices into silent witnesses of human behavior. So you do need to understand the forensics value of IoT. These devices often are going to record the ambient environmental data and user interaction without the user even knowing that it's doing it. Now, these are going to make them very excellent sources to help us build our timeline data as we go through our forensics investigation. Now, to investigate IoT, you must understand the three-layer architecture. Evidence rarely exists in one place. You often need data from all three layers in order to build a proper picture. So the edge, otherwise known as the perception layer, is the sensor itself. It has limited storage, but this is where like the motion sensor would be, or the security camera, or the door sensor would be. The gateway, or the network layer, this normally is going to act as the bridge, and it's going to aggregate data from multiple sensors. Think about the gateway as a centralized hub that sends all data to a centralized unit. Maybe it's going to a cloud service, to the internet, or to a cloud server on-prem. Finally, the cloud, the application layer, acts as a central server storing all of the long-term history and analytics. You do need to memorize these three layers of IoT: perception, edge, network, gateway, and application, cloud. These are fundamental terms on the exam, and they like to use them interchangeably to say which layer is responsible for specific tasks like data routing or environmental sensing. Now, IoT devices are notoriously insecure. They often are going to fall victim to the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, and common forensic findings include maybe weak passwords, where hard-coded credentials allow botnets like Mirai to take over. We often see insecure interfaces like exposed UART or JTAG ports, which allow physical attackers to dump firmware itself. And lastly, a sheer lack of updates leave the devices running vulnerable. And they're outdated on production networks. A lot of these devices are set and forgets, and they're normally put in the same devices as some of our most secure hardware. So we do need to be familiar with things like the Mirai botnet, which is a classic example of an IoT-based attack, where they're leveraging default hard-coded passwords across thousands of IP cameras and routers to launch a massive DDoS attack. So why is IoT forensics so difficult? Well, first, they almost all use proprietary operating system. Often they run RTOS, which is real-time operating systems like VxWorks, rather than standard Windows or even Linux. Secondly, there's normally no standard storage. You won't find a SATA port, or data is normally found on soldered flash chips. And then third, they're highly volatile. They normally store a lot of their operating information in RAM, and it's overwritten constantly via those circular logging systems because there's hardly any storage there, so they have to use what they have. Finally, there's often no screen or UI, meaning you can't just simply log into a smart light bulb to check its configuration. For the exam, know that circular logging is a key concept. It means that once the small local storage is full, the device is going to continuously override the oldest data with the newest data, making prompt evidence collection critical. We also call this rolling log information when we're dealing with Windows or Linux environments. So to help tackle these challenges, investigators are going to use a 3-level approach. Level 1 is the device level. Now this is going to involve physical acquisition and extracting firmware directly from the chips. Level 2 is the network level. This is where we're going to focus on capturing network traffic and sniffing things like Zigbee or Bluetooth and analyzing those PCAP files. Level 3 is the cloud level. This is where we're going to use the API extraction or legal subpoenas to download any server-side history that we can get. Now we need to understand that if a device is heavily damaged or physically inaccessible, the investigator must pivot their strategy to level 2, where we can intercept network traffic, or even level 3, where we go to the cloud provider to capture the evidence ourselves. So let's look at some of the smart home devices like Alexa or Google Home. These speakers are almost always listening, and they're looking for a wake word. These voice recordings are stored in the cloud and can prove exactly who was in the room and what was said. The timestamps of these queries are highly valuable. A critical investigative tip is use the companion app installed on the user's smartphone. It's often going to cache logs and configuration data, making it easier to target the easier to pull the data from than the speaker itself, is what I'm trying to get at. The companion app on the phone is often the least passive resistance, is really why we want to go that direction, because it's going to help us bridge the gap between mobile forensics and yield cache commands and linked account details quicker than the subpoena to the cloud provider themselves. Now, wearables like Fitbits, Apple Watches are incredible biometric evidence because they track the human body continuously. A famous example is the Richard debate case, where Fitbit data was proved that the victim was walking around long after her husband claimed she was killed. Forensically, we took a look at the heart rate as signs of struggle at time of death, steps, and GPS to validate and to break alibis, and then sleep data to establish patterns of consciousness. Wearables provide patterns of life data. The exam might present a scenario where standard alibis contradict the biometric data, like steps recorded while the suspect claims to have been asleep. Drones, on the other hand, act like a black box in the sky. They can store massive amounts of telemetry data. And we'll use specialized tools like DATCON or CSV View, or even Celebrite, just like we do with the cell phones, to parse this data. The flight logs reveal exact GPS data, altitude, speeds, and a home point. The media on the SD card often contains photos or embedded EXIF GPS data. Don't forget that the controller, both physical and the remote paired, can also have a ton of data cached within its flight logs. For the exam, they like to say the home point is a critical forensic artifact for drone investigations. It usually is going to pinpoint the exact physical location of the drone operator when the device was initially powered on and acquired its initial GPS lock. Now, modern cars are essentially computers on wheels, right? And the industry standard for investigating them is going to be the Burla IV. The information and telematic modules lets you monitor everything. This is one of those weird tools that have some really cool names in it that I'm just like, wow, you went a little too far in it. We will like to extract track logs and historical GPS routes from the car. Even if the navigation system was not actively routing, we can still pull this information. We could also pull information like when a door was open or when hard braking occurred. And more importantly, we can pull data from connected devices. Cars aggressively sync contacts, SMS, and call logs from any phone that was ever paired through Bluetooth or even USB. Now, automotive forensics is highly valuable because people routinely pair their smartphones to rental cars or suspects' vehicles, inadvertently dumping their entire contact list and recent call logs to the car's permanent memory. There's a ton of information that we can pull from the automotive side. Critical infrastructure involves industrial IoT. So in the medical field, IoMT, devices like pacemaker and insulin pumps contain volatile, highly proprietary data. The obsolete rule here is a safety first. So attempting a live extractant on a medical device attached to a patient can be fatal, and in the industry sector, like SCADA devices, we deal with programmable logic units, other known as PLCs, and sensors providing protocols like Modbus. Forensics here, on the other hand, is we can find unauthorized controls or other data, and a lot of times this data is not secure. So we have to be careful. If we're dealing with medical, IOMT, it's always a safety first scenario. But if we're dealing with industrial, a lot of times we can find that information in the clear text and get log information there. But be aware that they are very highly volatile systems and are easily corruptible and easily crashed. So we do need to understand the ethical and safety constraints of Internet of Medical Things. The exam may test your understanding to prioritize human life above all other evidence. And I will tell you, there are questions like that. And remember, human life is always number one over anything else that you can pull. Now, when you cannot access via standard ports, you must use the hardware's interfaces directly on the circuit board. So UART is a serial console port. If unsecured by the manufacturer, which a lot of times it is, it can often grant an investigator a root shell. JTAG is a hardware debugging port that allows reading and writing memory directly. Like SPI and I2C are serial communication protocols that are used to normally talk to the processor directly through its flash media. For the exam, you really just need to know the acronyms. Know that UART, Universal Asynchronous Retrieval Transmitter, is used for embedded system to allow for a serial access. That's really it. So UART equals serial, JTAG equals debugging, while SPI and I2C is normally flash media. Now, when all else fails, we'll perform chip-off forensics. This is a destructive but complete physical extraction. Because we apply heat to melt the solder and we physically remove the memory chip, there is a serious risk of destroying data. It is only used as a last resort. The process involves heating the board, removing the NAND or the flash chips, cleaning the pins, and placing it onto a specialized chip reader so we can read the raw binary data. Now, chip off is considered a destructive forensic technique because the host device is permanently disabled. Understanding that this technique requires highly specialized hardware, soldering expertise, making it a final option. So normally you don't see this too often unless we are desperate. Now, before resorting to chip off, we often prefer non-destructive hardware methods where the device survives, right? Really. So ISP, or in-system programming, involves soldering microscopic wires directly to the test points on the motherboard to read the chip without removing it. Alternatively, if the board has JTAG headers intact, we may even emulate a JTAG system to physically halt the CPU at the command and dump the entire RAM and flash to us. Understanding that ISP and JTAG are preferred to over chip off because they don't require complete desoldering and physical removal of the chips is something that we may have to have in mind when we're taking the test. So we try to do our traditional dumping of data, then we try to use ISP and JTAG, and if all else fails, we may resort to chip off, as we will destroy the original device. Now, IoT devices don't just speak on standard TCP/IP, they usually speak on specialized protocols. Zigbee and Z-Wave are low-power mesh networks, and they're commonly used for things like smart bulbs. To intercept them, you need a specific radio sniffer like a HackRF or an MQTT server, where you can have lightweight protocols for publishing and subscription models, and it's often going to be sent in plain text. So if you can capture this, you can get plain text versions of all this information. Now, you do need to be familiar with MQTT. It is heavily used in the IoT environments, mostly for sensor telemetry, and as a frequent lack of encryption makes it making sniffing an actual effective method to capture that information. Now, once we have all this raw data, we've gone through all of this, and we've got some raw data, we need to parse it into a file system. You won't find traditional Windows NTFS here. Instead, you're going to encounter things like Squash file system, which is a compressed read-only file system. It's very common for storing base firmware because it is read-only. You'll also find GFF32 and UBFS, which are specialized systems designed to handle wear and tear, handle the wear leveling quirks of raw flash memory. And then you're also going to find the YAFSS, which is an older file system. Normally you're going to find that on like Android systems. They're old, but you may still come across them. Now, the exam may ask you to identify a file system with the associated Linux firmware. Knowing that SquashFS is a standard answer for highly compressed read-only firmware blobs. That's the one that I find is normally the number one tested upon. Now, IoT Forensic Toolbox requires some specialized software and hardware. We can use things like binwalk. This is going to be for firmware analysis, really great for SquashFS. And we can use standard tools like Autopsy to parse like Linux file systems, or Magnet Axiom for ingesting the outputs from tools like Burla or drone extractors to help us build a timeline. But as we go through these tools, just know that binwalk is probably the most critical tool to know, because it's going to be the industry standard utility for reverse engineering and extracting file systems from the firmware itself. In IoT, most of the time we're dealing with a firmware system. Finally, we return to the cloud connection. Now, the reality is that most IoT devices are just dumb terminals acting as servers or sensors. The real hard drive and the actual logic normally is going to live in the cloud. So it might be in IWS IoT. And the key artifacts on these devices could be like the API tokens or the JSON data packets. The advanced method here is to extract the API key from the device firmware and then use that key to query the cloud service directly and download the user's complete historical data. So the slide ties back to the 3-layer approach. The exam expects you to recognize that acquiring the physical device is often a stepping stone to recovering the encryption keys or the API keys needed to access the cloud data repository. Because if I can get the API key from the device, we don't have to subpoena the cloud environment to actually get the data from them. So to summarize chapter 15, keep in mind the 3-layer approach. Know there are other methodologies like advanced firmware skills like JTAG or chip off ways of getting data. And then above all, when you're dealing with the exam especially, that safety is number one. So human life always is number one. So be extremely cautious with lithium batteries and drones and phones, and never perform live extractions on active medical devices themselves. Now, a core takeaway for the exam is recognizing when to escalate extraction techniques. Always start with logical and network and cloud methods before risking the destruction of evidence through physical hardware extractions. All right, guys. Well, we finally made it to the end of chapter 15. That is the end of the CHFI prep guide. I hope that you guys get something out of these last 15 chapters as you prepare for the ECC Ethical Hacker Forensic Investigator exam. Good luck on the exam, and I'll see you for the next course.